Welcome back everyone to CCT 250. Today we're getting into Chapter 14, Incident Response. Now, this is a chapter that's a little bit different than we've talked about before, mostly because it falls into the realm of GRC, or Governance, Risk, and Compliance. So this is how we deal with incidents that can deal with disruption or disaster incidents in a business in terms of continuity problems. So we're going to look at how to perform incident handling appropriately, various methods that we can incorporate. We're also going to look at the concept of incident response, what the process looks like, how to design and implement an incident response plan, which is not too far off from a disaster recovery plan or a business continuity plan as well. Disaster and recovery in general, what do we deal with in terms of a crisis? What defines a disaster? What are some different disasters that we might be likely to experience? Evidence handling, if we need to be able to preserve evidence for criminal investigation or for insurance purposes, and then the requirements of different regulated industries. So what is a security incident? A security policy is where we start, and that's a high-level description of how an organization defines a secure environment. A security control is a mechanism that enforces this policy. Now, this mechanism could be a technical or non-technical implementation. It could be something like a door lock or a security guard, or it could be a password policy. An event is an observable occurrence in a computer, device, or network. So, anything that we can observe and discreetly be able to identify, its own separate occurrence. And then an incident, the whole point of this slide, is that at any point from the desktop to the infrastructure that makes the network work, a problem that can be demonstrable. So an incident means that this is something that is negative or needs to be logged in a very specific separate category. So it's an event, but with a negative connotation. So in the incident response policy, or the RP, we need to list a couple of things. We need to figure out who's responsible if an incident has occurred. One of the most unhelpful things that you can do for yourself if you're trying to draft or improve an IRP is to ignore this step. We need to be aware of who's responsible for various aspects of incident response, because in certain cases an organization may be very large, so it may be that there are multiple individuals that have to work in a particular context. You may also have situations where there's a lot of moving parts, so making sure that somebody doesn't overstep, that we don't start creating breaches in security by having a person who is not qualified to handle certain types of response being involved in a particular department's recovery. So we need to make sure we know who is responsible. We need to make sure that we know what the scope of their responsibilities are, things like that. And it's better to do it early on, well before the incident ever occurs, so that way you don't have to kind of sprint through it at the time the incident actually occurs. We also need to know who's part of the notification process. So if we have a security incident, for instance, we need to make sure that we know where in the chain of command that we find who needs to be called, who needs to be emailed. If anybody outside the company needs to be notified, do we need to be able to notify the police? In certain cases, do we need to notify, Department of Homeland Security or the FBI? Depending on what agencies we liaise with, that could be a very multi-tiered process. We need to be aware of who's going to take the lead in responding to the incident. We need to know what the appropriate guidelines are for response, what is considered a good response versus a less than desirable result. So the incident response process deals with how we react, right? We have the incident, we have to have some form of reaction in order to recover from that, and then we have the cleanup. So the plan is going to determine if we deal with it efficiently, or if the incident gets worse. Because of course, if we don't acknowledge the incident and deal with it, the likelihood is it's just going to continue to get worse. But if we do deal with it, we want to make sure that we're not putting, gasoline on the fire. We must investigate with care. So this is why the process should be lined out very clearly, so that way we don't accelerate problems that are time sensitive. Computer crime is kind of a tough one because a lot of the evidence is intangible. We talk about our order of volatility and how there's various aspects of recovery that are difficult to maintain if we don't pay attention to the steps. How are we supposed to recover the CPU cache if the system's been rebooted 2 or 3 times? How do we make sure that we get a dump of accurate information from the hard drive if it's been wiped? There's things that we have to make sure that we're paying attention to. Computer crime is just any act that involves national security as well as a computer. It's crime that occurs on a computer, but we have to make sure that computer crime is defined much more structurally in terms of it may involve fraud. You may have somebody who is spoofing identities or having fraud in terms of stock manipulation. You can have things, theft of intellectual property by means of a falsely procured identity. And then you can also have distribution of malware. So computer crime could be infecting, the pipeline with ransomware. We've heard about that process several times in the news cycle over the last 2 years or so. So it's important to understand that, computer crime is the same as a crime that takes place in the physical world. And procurement of evidence and processing of that evidence still has to follow similar rules. So we've got our phases here. We're going to go through each of these individually over the next couple of slides, but I wanted to give you kind of an overview. Preparation and planning, incident ID, containment, investigation, eradication, recovery and repair, and the lessons that we have learned. And that last bit is definitely very important because any incident that occurs is going to cost resources. To maximize what those resources would have yielded us otherwise, we have to turn loss into gain. We have to be able to say we're going to fix what we had as a problem before and make it into a non-issue or a more secured issue the next time. So phase 1, we're going to create and train a computer security incident response team, or CCERT. So this team is going to be specifically tasked with developing plans for handling incidents, assessing an incident, pre, post, and mid-occurrence in certain cases. Certain events actually are kind of prolonged in terms of their active period. And then we have to assign roles and responsibilities to make sure we know whose hand is on the collar of the perp, if you want to use law and order slang. And we also need to make sure that we have the correct equipment. So this means that we need to have certain supplies, both hardware and software, present in order to carry out our tactics. In the identification phase, we need to figure out what's actually happened. It's very easy to guess, but we need to be able to have demonstrable evidence of what's going on. Is this a security incident? Is this something else? And when I say something else, it could be less difficult to deal with, or it could be more difficult to deal with. It could be endemic of a larger problem. So again, that's why we want to make sure that we have these criteria so that we can say, oh, this is big, or oh, this is pilot error, man. We just need to go ahead and reboot this. The SIEM pulled a false positive or something similar. The CCERT is responsible for making this determination because they are trained and usually certified in certain capacities to be able to figure out what is or is not a security incident. If necessary, and it is an incident identifiably, we can then go ahead and begin the official response process, start the documentation, and start the remediation as well, being able to keep the process from getting worse. So containment is where we go ahead and control damage early on. We're trying to keep it from spreading. We don't want to alter the environment or tamper with evidence, and we realize that there's a point where that's going to have to be crossed, that line in particular. So what we're doing in the containment phase is balancing the requirements of reducing the scope of damage and preserving evidence. If we start disconnecting things, if we start shutting things down, if we start doing things that would be direct involvement with keeping the machine from performing functions, that could be considered tampering with evidence. So we have to make sure that we have a way to balance those two pieces. In the investigation phase, this is where you start getting into, certified forensics investigators, things like that. If you do the CFHI through EC Council, they go through the processes of dealing with volatility in terms of evidence and how to contain things appropriately, document and photograph everything. And it's all about methodical collection of evidence without damaging it. We don't want to destroy it. We don't want to alter it. We want to make sure that, if we have to unplug something from the wall, that we have recovered all the information necessary from it beforehand, especially things that would be erased or modified if the power was removed, so things that are non-long-term storage. This can be performed by an internal team or an external team. In certain cases, it may not be cost effective to have an internal team that's constantly just there. So what you may do instead is have a team that you contract out in the event of an incident. This team, again, has to be trained, usually certified very much in the same way that your CCERT would be, in order to understand how to collect evidence properly. If criminal activity is involved, the guidance of law enforcement is going to be involved, and the level of law enforcement is going to be contingent on what type of incident happened. In the eradication phase, we assume that everything has been collected evidence-wise that we need. Now we need to go through and figure out what allowed the incident to occur and how do we make sure it does not happen again. We could have configuration changes. Maybe we had a default password that was left behind. Maybe there was a line that was active that shouldn't have been on a switch, like an aux line or something similar. Software updates. Let's go ahead and make sure that all of our patches are current. Maybe we had not run an update that we should have because of bad patch management policy. And that extends to, if the software updates the problem, what is the regulation in our controls that made it possible to not work in the first place? Well, we dig in and say, oh, well, patch management needs to be adjusted, so let's go ahead and submit that and have it approved by the requisite parties. And then physical modifications. There may be situations where, oh, this door lock is garbage. It turns out that it's really easy to break it if you have a chisel and a 5-pound sledge. So let's go ahead and get a case-hardened shell for it, and we'll replace that and make sure that anything that could have been, like if any keys or anything could have been compromised, let's go ahead and make sure we get those replaced. Eradication can be costly, so just bear in mind that it's not as simple as flipping a switch. We may have to deploy new or modified controls. It may be that remediation involves multiple steps. There's kind of a ripple effect from that, and this is a good thing. This is right and proper because you don't want it to be that you're putting band-aids on a bullet wound. You don't want to have to just have these little bitty feel-good changes that don't really do anything in the long run. Now, once we've gotten to the point where we've cleared out the vulnerability, everything's been contained, let's do recovery and repair. We're assuming that all relevant evidence has been collected. I would say that's probably about 2 phases ago. Now let's try and get the system back up and running. Let's go ahead and make sure everything seems to be where it should be. Go ahead and restore and rebuild your operating systems, basically re-imaging everything, making sure that we are not in a position where the system is unable to perform normally. So we have to make sure that all of our applications and data are in place, and that we're able to access our backup systems if we have them, which you should always have, depending on how they're set up. If you have CDP, constant data protection, that is going to be more of a getting the network up and running rather than the software itself. Usually the software is just kind of a set it and forget it. Any systems that have been damaged, we will have to be aware of the replacement policy. In most cases, if we have evidence that's going to be submitted before a jury or through any other type of examination, we need to remove those components and replace them with a suitable alternative. So if there's a hard drive that contains evidence that we're going to need to submit for investigation, then we can't reuse that hard drive, obviously, so we need to go ahead and put in a new one. We may have the same thing happen if we have compromised firmware on a motherboard, or the firmware of a switch or a router. Those things are going to all incorporate the requirements of moving on to a newer piece of equipment, or at least just a suitable equivalent to preserve evidence. And then our lessons learned. This is our recap, right? We need to debrief and obtain feedback from everyone that was involved. We need to know what we did right, what we did wrong, and how do we do better. No process is perfect. You can do things in an incredibly efficient way, but there's always something that we can do that's better, so we need to have that goal of constant vigilance to be able to improve. Debriefing can also be used to determine changes that will be made to improve the process. So when we talk to our team, was there a barrier? Was there something that made it harder to do your job? It helps, because people need to be able to feel confident in saying, I was doing the best I could, but there were things that were impediments. So being able to produce that, so that in the recap we can say, okay, is there something that we as a team can bring to bear that will help in the future? It may also be necessary that we have to start informing the client, whoever the client may be, or agencies, regulatory bodies, etc. The failure to inform a regulatory body can result in fines and other negative sanctions, which we really do not want. So if at all possible, let's make sure that that is well defined in the incident response plan. We need to make sure that we understand at what point are we supposed to inform whomever. So the incident response team is another title for the CSIRT. Incident response team could be in any department, just by title, but when we specifically say computer security incident, we're talking about IT personnel, legal representation, because of course there may be situations where we have to have event disclosure to certain bodies, as we just talked about in our previous slide. The leaders of affected departments, if somebody was trying to hack payroll in order to get information about employees, then the head of the payroll department needs to be made aware, because they need to be able to make informed decisions about how they can improve matters. What is it that was contributing to the incident that they have the ability to affect change on? Human resources. If employees are affected, and they almost always will be, HR needs to be able to disseminate that information for us and be able to deal with any potential incident of discipline. If somebody committed an action, intentionally or not, that contributed in a major way to the breach or whatever the incident was, we need to be able to address that. We need to be able to have a conversation about that. Public relations. This is really, that's a very specific phase. That's once we get to the point where we have to talk about disclosures. It may not be even something that's necessary for your particular organization type. And then, of course, security officers and your chief security officer, who's going to be, and here's something that's interesting, and this is something I've run into personally. I used to work security, like just, white uniforms and a giant flashlight kind of thing, a long time ago. And we would get called in as kind of a listening tank, or when you get into supervisory positions, you would get into like sounding board positions, to where the computer security team would bounce things off of you, saying, as a boots on the ground guard, as a supervisor or firewatch monitor, what do you see that could compromise our facilities, physical facilities? And that's an interesting point, because we don't always remember that with a computer security incident, there are still physical interfaces that are going to be huge potential avenues of compromise. If there's a computer that's just sitting there and it's in an area that's not well monitored, and it's not well secured, and it's not updated consistently, that can be a huge entry point into the system of problems. Somebody could load it up with malware that affects any flash drive that it touches, and that flash drive spreads around. And it's like the common cold, just these little points of contact, and then all of a sudden the whole system is in danger. So security officers do not have to be technically oriented. They just have to be security oriented. And that's where the division of labor is very important and very useful. So incident response plans tend to take two major forms: business continuity and disaster recovery. Continuity is exactly what it sounds like, to continue. How do we maintain normal day-to-day business after an event has occurred? Well, this can take several forms. It can be, is there kind of a limping situation going on where we're on running kind of wounded? Is it there's a very short period of shutdown? We hope very short. Or do we have a duplicate site that we're able to just jump right into? You know, that's going to depend on the amount of money and preparation that is present for that particular organization. A disaster recovery plan is a little bit different because it specifically looks at a crisis level event and says, how are we going to safeguard personnel and assets? You know, we have to look at the products that we're dealing with, we have to look at the people, and we have to look at what the rule changes may need to be in this particular event. And then once assets are out of the danger zone, how do we recover? How do we bring everything back to operational states? One of the ways in which we can improve our system's ability to be resistant to an incident is to increase fault tolerance. Fault tolerance traditionally comes into two categories, either performance or backups, redundancies. Now, RAID, of course, is one of the big ones, redundant array of independent disks. It used to be inexpensive disks, that's how I first learned it, but now in these days, you know, Cyber Monday was looking at, Seagate has an 18 terabyte Iron Wolf NAS drive for $300, I think. So, you know, inexpensive is no longer really the name of the game, I guess, relatively speaking. RAID is a cluster of disks that are built in sequence so that if one disk fails, we can reduce the level of impact to the rest of the system. So you may have, you know, RAID 0 or RAID 1, which would be either 0 is striping, to where we split the load of reading and writing across drives, or we may have mirroring, where we have two disks, one is copying the other so that we have a backup locally in case of any events, and then we can expand out from there. We can have striping with parity checks, we can have striping and mirroring, there's tons of different configurations. Server clustering is a way that we can group the connectivity of servers together in such a way that if one server fails, access to an application is not lost. And this usually follows the same principles as RAID, to where we distribute either a redundant copy or a distributed copy of the system in order to keep it from being dependent on one point of failure. Redundant power. You know, systems are great. You know, we can have all kinds of issues to keep the system from losing data, but if it doesn't have power, it's traditionally not just going to run on its own. So we need to make sure that we have backup generators, uninterrupted power supplies, etc. I do need to point out, RAID is not a backup in and of itself. It deals with, you know, fault tolerance. It's not specifically a backup. A backup needs to be something that can be taken off-site, because if we have a RAID system and the building burns down, you know, you can have 20 disks in a RAID configuration, and all of those disks will be just as susceptible to damage. But if we have a disk where we copy everything to a portable hard drive or something similar, or if we have, you know, CDP, continuous data protection, as I mentioned on the previous slide, that will be uploaded somewhere that is not physically in the same location. And that is a true backup, to where, you know, that thing could be, you know, carpet bombed, and we would have another copy somewhere else. Cloud services and virtual machines. This gives us the ability to be able to provision servers and resources based on need. This starts moving into the as a platform or as a service systems, being able to host infrastructure virtually. You know, VMs are great, and then cloud-based VMs are also really helpful, especially for a business that needs a lot of what we call elasticity. The system is able to increase or decrease its resource pool in relation to what is demanded of it at that time. This helps to be able to reduce cost. It also helps us to be able to deal with spikes and ebbs in activity for the business. System recovery, loss control, and damage assessment. Well, it's important to understand that system recovery is going to be a process. Loss control is, you know, we're going to go ahead and sever this particular aspect. We got to, whenever you deal with amputation in the physical world with a body, right? Like somebody has massive damage to a limb. They've suffered an accident, heaven forbid, and they have to have that limb removed because there's no way to safely recover it. Maybe there's infection, maybe there's gangrene. You have to look at a system, like a computer system, the same way. There are certain things where you have to cut your losses. So we want to have a plan to require operations to get back into the swing of things quickly, but quickly is relative, right? We want to be able to revive everything and get it going, but we want to make sure that we're not setting ourselves up for failure. We have to be able to assess the damage, complete our investigation, and conduct the recovery process. And that may sometimes mean that operations are going to be running in parallel to that in a different site or in a different way. How do we assess damage? Well, let's go ahead and assess the scope. We need to figure out what all it's affecting. There may be situations where we have to assess this very quickly and then start putting out fires, if you will. We want to start shutting down systems that could potentially spread the issue. Once we've gotten our course of action established, we need to go ahead and start incorporating this by determining what type of damage is present. Virtual damage is going to, of course, be in the intangible items, and then physical damage is going to be the actual inventory of stock, physical items that we have. The firmware of a switch would be a consideration for virtual damage, but the actual physical switch itself, in the event of a fire or physical tampering, is going to be a very different thing. We also want to determine if the attack is over or if it is still ongoing. That's part of our scope assessment. Is this spreading? Is this something that we can directly contain? Business Impact Analysis, or BIA. This refers to the process of analyzing existing risk and documenting our strategies to minimize said risk. Now, risk is always going to be part of a business's operations. There's no such thing as risk-free. You'll hear the term, it's not really the case. Very minimal risk, possibly, or very concealed risk, yes. So if we have existing risk, the likelihood that a negative outcome is possible, we need to be able to minimize that, right? The outcome of BIA results in a report that covers all potential risk uncovered, not all risk period, but just what we've discovered, and the effect on the organization, and how we deal with that is going to be the next step. So we need to make sure that we have proper redundancy measures for critical resources. This can mean duplication, this can mean support hardware, takes several forms. Check with your critical service providers like your ISP or power company to make sure that adequate protection has been taken to guarantee that services provided will still be available. If we have to maintain a 4-star uptime, then we have to make sure that we have the capacity to be able to have systems that we use for failover. The ability to obtain spare hardware, the existence of spare hardware in some cases, especially if it's a custom-built system. Evaluate your SLAs, service level agreements, in order to determine what type of downtime is acceptable. I mentioned the 4-star a moment ago. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as stars or by the 9s. So if you have 4 9s, that means you have a 99.99% uptime. The highest I've seen is 6 9s, so it's 99.9999. So that means all but 1/10,000th of a percent of your time active is uptime. Now, over the course of a year, that means like you've got a downtime of like 30 seconds. It's really, really serious stuff. But we also have to remember with the SLAs, what defines downtime? Is it partial access? Is it full access? Is it access with delays, etc.? We want to make sure that we establish mechanisms for communication that don't require company resources. So this may mean, have a provision for, personal cell phones to be used given a certain security profile, etc. Ensure that your designated alternate site, if you have one, can be accessed immediately. Identify and document points of failure, as well as redundancy measures. And make sure that redundant storage is secure, as well as making sure that it is not susceptible to the same types of disasters that your main site is. Then we have testing and evaluation. We need to make sure that our plans are good, and how do we do that? Well, we try and break them. That's something that's kind of foreign to people who haven't really played with security testing much in the real world, is that, you think you build this lovely plan and that's it. That's not the case. You want to make sure that you don't have a house of cards with a card missing on the bottom. You want to make sure that this thing is robust, resilient, has the ability to demonstrate all of the items that you feel should be present. So we want to test the plan out, make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. We also need to review the plan regularly and adopt changes if necessary. We want to make sure that it's a living document, because your business is constantly going to expand, contract, change. And if that's the case, then your business plan for continuity, disaster recovery, incident response, all of those things need to be able to be as responsive and mutable as the business itself. Consider events that can affect or diminish the strength of the plan. Are there certain events that are more potentially damaging than others? Are there things that are going to be considered critical damage points? Emphasize your plan's strengths and weaknesses. The hardest thing to do for a lot of people is being able to shoot down their own idea, but it's the only thing that makes sure that your idea is good. And good's relative, but if you can find the holes in your plan, it makes you make a better plan the next time. You have to be able to prove and disprove your point. We also want to make sure that we're engaging parties and teams with special skills and training if necessary. Not everybody's going to be good at everything, so we have to make sure that we call in the experts when needed. And that can take several forms. You may have somebody that is an absolute whiz with part A, but is absolutely pants at part B. So we want to make sure that we have strengths to accommodate for that. Excuse me. We also want to make sure that we can verify the effectiveness of a plan. And that kind of ties back into our first point, which is test and evaluate. So not only do we want to evaluate the plan through revising the documentation, but we also want to engage in what are called dry runs or drills. And this is going to allow us to see in a real world event what happens. And you can often engage an outside agency to assist with that type of thing. Preparation and staging of testing procedures. First part is the structured walkthrough. The members of the recovery team get around a table and we read through the plan together. We read through the steps, figure out how each department involves and interacts. This is your responsibility, this is your responsibility, so on. This helps us define potential gaps or bottlenecks. So if we have an area that is not necessarily able to be covered, then we need to make sure that we know whose responsibility it is. If there's a bottleneck, which is where we have a kind of a choke point, everything has to funnel through this one particular area or this one small aspect. Is there a way to widen the channel a little bit? Is there more resource that we can pour into that to make it less of a standing on our own fingers kind of situation? The next piece is the checklist. This type of test assists in verifying that sufficient supplies are stored and available at the backup site, contact information is current, recovery plans accessible, it's available to all who would need it in emergency situations. And we can also review and identify weak areas that may need to be reinforced. What resources are available to ameliorate those weak points. Then we have the simulation. This is where normal business operations are not adversely affected. Maybe on a weekend or a day that's going to be lower activity, we can run through simulation of a disaster as accurately as we can and as practically as we can given the budget and situation. Features here would be practicing backup and restore, incident response, communication and coordination, alternate site usage, etc. There are some processes that are probably not going to be able to be economically completed or practical. So those should be omitted where necessary, but we need to document. We need to make sure we're aware of those things. Travel requirements, key system takedowns, so certain team involvements, those are all good. And at least once a year, unfortunately, we have to do this, full interruption, full shutdown. In this type of test, the complete DRP is enacted under simulated conditions. We simulate a disaster, including simulation of damage to systems or things like that. Like, we're not actually going to take a hammer to a router, but we may put like a piece of tape on it and unplug all of the cables so that we know we cannot use this one. We need to go ahead and get the other one out of the replacement site, get it bolted up, mounted into the rack, recabled and configured. Do we have a flash drive or similar item that we can load those configs really quickly, make sure all of our port configurations are good? Because of the fact that this test interrupts services in the organization itself, we want to make sure that this is very carefully monitored and regulated. We do not want to incur a major effect on the organization itself. So you may have a business that runs 24/7. Unfortunately, we're going to have to figure out a way around that. So you may want to move actual operations to a secondary site or something similar. At the end of the month, slow periods of business, after normal business hours, overnight if you can, and at any point where critical operations will not directly be affected. In some businesses that's easier than others. Now, we've done our testing, several forms of it. Now we need to look at the test results. The testing is going to give us an idea of how well the plan works. It also gives us the ability to provide feedback to the disaster recovery team and say, okay, this is what you guys said needed to be improved. This is what we observed. Let's see if that lines up, because if your pain points and our observed pain points match, then that is definitely a priority item that we need to address. We also need to look at the results of what happens to the process. How does the plan come about? Does everything eventuate the way that we would expect, even if we throw some surprise monkey wrenches in there? Analyze recommendations regarding improvements or modification to the plan. Quantitatively measure the test results. We want to be able to have metrics by which we can say this was successful, this was not successful, to what degree was it successful or unsuccessful. We want to have a bar to say if we can maintain this, then that's acceptable. If we're above or below, then we're not. So that means that we have to be able to break these things up into pieces that can be more digestible. Test results may lead to changes in the plan, as they should. In science, we talk about all the time how evidence will often change the phase space of the environment that we're observing, so we have to be able to respond to that. Testing should also include scheduled and unscheduled tests for both total and partial disasters. So we want to make sure that not only are we doing these full interruption tests, but on occasion we may want to do kind of a drill to where we have to move from again, a state of normal operation to a state of emergency operation. And it's not necessarily that we need to completely surprise everybody, because that, again, would kind of violate our cardinal directive of we don't want to cause major incidents. But department heads may need to be aware, and then the employees are just kind of the ones who get it sprung on them, the entry levels and things like that. It's not always fun, but you know what? Incident response is not about fun, it's about safety, and it's about results. If we have an actual incident and we have to get into evidence handling, it's important to understand that there are forensic specialists that will likely need to be involved. Forensic specialists are a very different animal to a normal networking administrator or even a security operative. Forensic specialists will specifically be able to apply science in order to extract information regarding the legal profession, as it pertains to computer evidence, physical evidence, etc. We need to maintain the chain of custody, meaning that we know who has been handling this evidence, where has it been going, where is it to be stored. In order to maintain its veracity, we're trying to make sure that that evidence is not easy to tamper with, or if it is, then there's a very clear indicator of that. We need to make sure that we have legal authorization to be able to collect computer evidence if necessary. If we are able to collect evidence internally, then it may just mean that we have to document according to a particular set of rules. There may be a certain set of standards that we have to follow. Those rules of evidence will be laid out as part of the plan and will be well ingrained into our forensic specialists before they ever have cause to come on site. The chain of custody documents the whereabouts of the evidence from the time it's collected to the time it's presented in court. In some cases, it may also keep track of the evidence after the fact. So here are some bullet points of things that we need to be aware of. What evidence has been collected? How is it obtained? When and where was the evidence collected? who are the individuals that handled it, why did each person involved in the previous item have for handling the evidence, where has the evidence traveled, and where was it stored. We have to make sure that we're aware of the provenance of the evidence. If it came from the correct location, but was stored in a location later that might cause it to degrade in some way, that needs to be something that we have present for the court in case they request that information. And here's a handy little flow chart for different types of evidence from the top down. The best evidence is admissible by a requirement in any court of law. In the case of a document or similar, this is the original document or item. Secondary evidence, which you will often be working with as a forensic technician, is a copy. Backups or drive images. They may not always be admissible, but they allow you to dig through the information without damaging or altering the original evidence. Now, if the best evidence item exists, they will not normally allow secondary evidence without good reason. So just be aware of that. Direct evidence is received as the result of testimony or an interview of an individual regarding something that they directly experienced. Conclusive evidence is considered to be above dispute, to override all other types by its existence. That's usually going to be in the best category up there. Opinion-based evidence. Now there's going to be two different categories here. We have expert and non-expert. Expert is based upon facts, experience, and the expert's knowledge. Non-expert is limited to witness perception. So whoever that person is, whatever their perception may be. In some cases, non-expert evidence is actually more beneficial if you have a jury, because very rarely will that jury be based on experts. It will be, a jury of your peers, in the legislation parlance. So it'll be people who need a more ground level understanding. Now, this is usually going to be augmented and reinforced by expert evidence, but non-expert evidence can sometimes be more helpful in terms of conveying things to a jury. Corroborative evidence is, by its very nature, unable to stand on its own. It's obtained from multiple sources and is supportive in nature. We are bolstering other types of evidence. We're not providing it as its own individual item. It has to be something that enhances evidence already admitted. And then the last one is circumstantial evidence. We have to be careful with this one because this one will get shut down quite a bit. You'll have a defense attorney that's trying to protect their client, obviously, and they'll, objection, circumstantial, you'll have to be able to then defend it. Circumstantial evidence is any evidence that indirectly proves a fact through the use of deduction, but deductions can have flawed premises, so we have to be careful about that. That's why circumstantial evidence is not our best choice by any stretch. We want to make sure that our evidence, if at all possible, is going to be conclusive. The best possible format that we can get, if it's secondary and that's the best that we can do, then that's fine. Opinion-based evidence should be limited if at all possible. And corroborative evidence should be encouraged if we have strong primary evidence. The rules of evidence are fivefold. It must be reliable, consistent and trustworthy evidence that leads to a common conclusion. A term that you'll hear a lot in court regarding evidence is what a rational person would assume. And that's why, in a jury you usually have 8 to 12 people, because you need to make sure that you have a consensus across many different individuals who, based on their cross-section of the selection, should be rational, right? They should be able to make normative decisions. Evidence should be preserved, meaning that we have to observe the chain of custody, and those records will help to identify and prove the preservation in question. Relevance is where the evidence directly relates to the case that's being tried. Properly identified, meaning that the evidence has records that provide preservation and identifiable proof. And then legally permissible. Evidence has to be legally permissible, like with a polygraph. Polygraphs are not considered admissible evidence due to the vagaries of how they're collected. An evidence piece that is deemed by the judge to fit the rules of evidence for the court and the case at hand is considered legally permissible. So how do we deal with security reporting once the incident, occurs? Supporting this is going to be a process. We want to refer to the guidelines documented in the incident response plan. Again, we're referring back to those documents. The incident has to be documented, but doesn't need to be reported. Company personnel needs to know, does law enforcement need to know? And this is going to depend on what type of incident it is. We also have to consider whether or not the regulatory bodies that we talked about much earlier are going to be involved. How is that information going to be collected and disseminated? Document the incident if it is externally reported. Talk about what was listed. So if there's a press release or things like that, make sure a PDF or a printout of that is attached. In a security incident report, we need a timeline. We need to know what happened. We need to know what the events were and then what actions were taken in response. We need to be able to do a risk assessment for the before and after of the system. We need to create a detailed list of all participants for discovery, assessment, and resolution. We need a list of the reasons behind the decisions that were made throughout the process and recommendations for remediation in the future. We want to make sure we repeat the steps, but not the incident. We want to prevent a repeat of the incident, as well as to reduce damage. If the incident is quote unquote inevitable, we want to make sure that our ability to cushion that impact is strong. So there's usually going to be two sections for an incident report. We're going to have a long report, or a quote unquote full report, which will give you your specific details and actions, and will usually be pretty lengthy because it's going to cover several sets of details, multiple organizations within the company that may need to be involved, including any external contractors. And then you have what's called a high-level executive summary, which is where we take a 40, 50-page report and burn it down to like 3 pages. Not necessarily because high-level executive summaries we're not trying to sugarcoat anything and we're not insulting the intelligence of the executive, but if they need further details, they will request them. If they feel that our summary is appropriate and representative of what the company's goals are, then we're able to go ahead and move forward. There are 3 requirements of a regulated industry, all starting with due, meaning that what is due, what is owed, what is present and required. Due care is a policy that describes and dictates how assets need to be maintained and used during company operation. Due diligence means that there is a process of investigation for any incident and related issues pertaining to a situation. And then due process is a key idea that when a policy or rule is violated, disciplinary procedures are followed uniformly, and employees are not considered guilty until they have given the proper investigation and process. So this keeps people from being able to be, it prevents people being punitive and vindictive. There's a difference between discipline and abuse. If you have a child, or if you know anybody that does, of course, they talk about how whether or not they go through, spanking, or what their particular remonstration may be for a particular rule violation. Well, that has to be something that is regulated in the terms of a business. It can't be, well, you're the one who's at fault, so you're going to be my pigeon. I'm going to be the one to, pull out the paddle and whoop you one. That can't be the process. We have to determine what is considered a reasonable response. Is something an individual's fault, or is it the failing of the system, and so on. So this set of processes requires that we do a significant amount of investigation to figure it out. So here's our summary. We're looking at incident response. We looked at some concepts, we looked at the process itself, some various plans. How do we deal with disaster and recovery? How do we deal with evidence handling, forensics, admissibility, and then requirements of regulated industries. A lot of stuff that companies consider to be their proper meat and potatoes, but most hackers consider to be kind of boring. If we're going to operate as an ethical hacker, we have one foot in 2 different worlds, and you know this. So be aware that there are going to be things that you're going to be called on to do as an EH or as a forensics investigator that may be very rote and seem very inconsequential, but it is necessary for the purposes of being able to exist in both the corporate world and in the more technical aspects. Thank you all so much for your time and attention. I appreciate you as always. If you have any questions, you can always contact me through YouTube, Blackboard, Wake Tech email, whatever it is you happen to need. I look forward to hearing from you, and hopefully you guys will come by my office hours and say hey before the end of the semester. And if not, well, no harm, no foul. That's the end of chapter 14. We've only got one left, and I will see you then. Take care.